highlights the history and global competition over semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to advanced weapon systems. Currently, Chris serves as a professor at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And so with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome the renowned Chris Miller to NVTC.
Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to join you all in what is, I well know, one of the centers of computing power, not just in the United States, but the entire world in Northern Virginia. What I'd like to suggest to you today is that computing power is key not just to the future of our economy as we develop artificial intelligence and deploy it at scale, but also central to the deployment of national power on the international stage. And so I'll share some thoughts on the semiconductor industry that has enabled the growth of this computing power and explore how computing power is driving our new era of artificial intelligence. But I thought I'd start, as you have to start all presentations now, by asking ChatGPT what it thinks first. And so I asked ChatGPT, how exactly do you work? And it got the answer partly right, but partly wrong in interesting ways. If you ask ChatGPT, you hear a lot about foundation models, about training data, about brilliant computer scientists, all of which is true, but misses what I think is the most important ingredient, which is the construction of vast data centers full of the most advanced semiconductors that make the training and the deployment of models like those that undergird ChatGPT possible. And you begin to understand why that's so important when you zoom out and look historically. Because what we've learned about artificial intelligence systems since the phrase AI was first coined in the 1950s all the way up to the present is that if you want a better system for artificial intelligence, you need a bigger system. That's been the fundamental law of AI now for almost 3/4 of a century. And it's a law that's being embraced by the world's biggest technology companies right now as they build ever larger data centers to train ever more advanced AI systems. It's called the scaling laws, and you can see it in the chart right here. This chart shows you the most advanced AI systems of each day from the 50s when the concept first emerged all the way up to the present day. And the vertical axis tells you how much computing power, measured in flops, was used to train these AI systems. And it's an exponential scale. And what you find is a couple of relatively straight lines. Every year or two, it becomes possible to train a bigger AI system, and these AI systems are dramatically better than their predecessors. And what's more, you find that over the last 15 years or so, as we've entered the deep learning era, the rate of increase has only accelerated. This is why there's today a scramble to build the world's biggest data centers and fill them with the most advanced semiconductors, which means that if you want to drive AI progress, it's certainly important to have smart people making better algorithms, but it's even more important to harness the computing power that makes it possible to train bigger and better systems. There's a famous computer scientist that described this as the bitter lesson. The bitter lesson was this: he was a very smart man. He had lots of improvements in computer science theory that he developed over the course of his career, but they were all outpaced by the development of better semiconductors and the improvement in computing power that enabled. In other words, whatever he came up with, any improvement in algorithms was helpful, but ultimately unimportant relative to the scaling of computing power. And that's what this chart shows from some of the world's leading AI researchers. Most of the improvements that have driven the AI systems that we're now using and deploying come not from smart people making better algorithms. They come from the deployment of bigger and better semiconductors in larger and larger data centers. In other words, computing power has been the key factor in driving better AI systems. That's been true for the last 75 years. And I think it will remain true, at least as far as we can see into the future. And you don't have to trust me when I say that, or trust the academics who've tried to quantify this. Just listen to what Sam Altman is regularly tweeting. Once every 3 months or so, he has to apologize to ChatGPT users that he can't give them the services they'd like because he has insufficient access to the GPU chips that make AI possible. And every quarter or so, he has to apologize again because he's released a new and better feature that requires even more computing power, and he's still unable to deploy them at scale because we're still building the data center infrastructure and the chips inside that this requires. And he's not alone. Every major tech CEO, both in the United States and in China, is making essentially the same bet. If you want to be a leader in AI, you need vast quantities of computing power. If you want computing power, you need the biggest data centers full of the most advanced semiconductors, which means that the semiconductors now, I would argue, the limiting factor in our ability to build bigger and better AI systems, which means the chip industry is finding itself in a new, but in some ways equally central position to where it's always been. And people in Northern Virginia, I think, have a unique understanding of the historic relationships between computing power and military power, a relationship which has existed since the first semiconductors and is more important now than ever before, but in perhaps some unique ways, which I'll get into. Here's one of the first computers to use integrated circuits. This was the guidance computer that went in the intercontinental ballistic missile known as the Minuteman II, one of the first computers deployed that ever used integrated circuits. And as many of you, I'm sure, are well aware, the entire chip industry, the concept of a chip emerged so that we could guide spacecraft and missiles more accurately. So there's been a deep relationship between the defense and national security enterprise in this part of the world, in Boston and the Bay Area, and the emergence of the chip industry and the computing power that it's enabled. And I would argue that that relationship is as important now as ever, even though the problem of guidance is now solved. My iPhone has better guidance, of course, than this computer could ever deliver, but we've moved on to new problems. Delivering autonomy, for example, at scale, delivering intelligent systems at scale, which require frontier levels of computing power. And again, this isn't just me saying this. This is our senior national security officials talking about the deployment of AI, the deployment of computer vision to national security problems, not in the sci-fi future, but today, over the past decade. And I would posit that the military operations that we've seen over the past 2 weeks and Israel's extraordinary intelligence capabilities vis-a-vis Iran could not be understood without some pretty extraordinary computing capabilities that made all of that possible. And so it's happening in the United States, it's happening certainly in Israel, but it's also happening in our adversaries. Everyone realizes that if you want cutting edge intelligence today, you need to deploy AI at very large scale. This is the frontier of computing and national security today. And it's why governments are seeing AI infrastructure, the data centers that make AI possible, as a national security priority. This is new. This is not something that in the past would have been seen as an issue that merited attention from the president. But both in the last administration and the current one, we've seen the questions of who should operate data centers and what level of computing power should they have and where exactly should they be built as issues that are of fundamental importance to both our future technological capabilities, but also to the future of national security. We've seen new technological alliances formed with countries in the Middle East over the deployment of advanced data centers. We've seen high-level political disputes between the US and other countries over restrictions on the ability to deploy advanced chips in advanced data centers. And I would posit that whether you're in Washington or in Tokyo or in Beijing or in Singapore, the question of AI infrastructure is not just seen as who can deploy the best chatbots. It's seen as a core lever of power in the modern world. Because if you want to run an AI system at scale, it's almost certainly the case you'll need to run that at least partly on the cloud. And the cloud means who's got access to these data centers, who's got the chips inside them, who's running the software on top of them, and who could potentially turn them on and off if need be. If you begin to look at that question and ask, well, who's deploying the biggest data centers? Who's got access to the most computing power? There are really only two countries that matter. There's the United States far ahead, China very clearly in the second position, and the rest of the world far, far behind. This is an estimate of the number of servers deployed by country. So you can try to make estimates that account for AI servers versus non-AI servers, but the basic picture is the same. The United States is far and away the world's leader. China is the only other real competitor, and everyone else is relying on data center infrastructure provided by companies from one of those two countries. This is the computing race as it exists today. And both of the two countries that are in the lead believe this is fundamentally important to their technological future, but also their political future. Both are pouring billions of dollars, or their technology companies are pouring billions of dollars into building the next generation of computing infrastructure. And both governments in Washington and in Beijing are trying to shape the race so that it benefits their companies and harms their adversaries. And the key choke point, the most important choke point, the hardest of all of the components to produce in the race to build out computing power that we see here, are the chips inside of the servers inside of these data centers. And here's a picture of what one of them looks like. This is an NVIDIA GPU, the chip on which 80 or 90% of all of the world's AI workloads today currently run. I would posit to you that this is the most complex device humans have ever produced at scale by the hundreds of thousands. Inside of a cutting edge NVIDIA system are hundreds of billions of transistors, the tiny circuits that turn off and on to produce the ones and zeros that make all computing, all AI training and deployment possible. And the supply chain needed to produce these chips is now a subject of intense geopolitical contestation, because the supply chain itself is defined by a series of monopoly choke points that are controlled almost exclusively by the United States and its allies. And a lot of the key choke points are actually controlled by our allies in what leads to a very complicated geopolitical map. And so I would argue to you that you can't understand the future of computing or the future of AI without understanding the supply chain that makes it all possible. And that supply chain is fundamentally a matter not just of technology or of business, but also of geopolitics, because it's a supply chain that has been designed over the past 30 years to harness the efficiencies of globalization, to take advantage of the brightest minds and the most advanced capabilities in Europe and in the United States and in Japan and in Korea and in Taiwan. And it's worked wonderfully well at driving forward technology, at delivering us more computing power at lower cost. But it intersects very uncomfortably with a new era of geopolitical fragmentation, especially because almost all, 99%, according to the company that makes the chips, of these key AI processors are manufactured by a single company in basically two factories in Taiwan. An extraordinary amount of concentration. If you'd gone back to prior areas of industrial revolution, whether it was the first industrial revolution in the 1820s, the deployment of steam at scale, or the second industrial revolution, the construction of vast steel mills and railroads across the United States and Europe, or the electrification of society, these were all trends that were possible to build in many countries. The British got them first, but then the French and the Belgians and the Germans shortly thereafter, the United States, and eventually China and India as well. But today there's a single country that produces almost all of the world's AI chips. A single company produces almost all of the world's AI chips. Never in history has there been an industrial revolution so concentrated in its supply chain, which has driven these efficiencies, made these technologies possible to devise at scale, but also introduced extraordinary risk in the supply chain. So what I'd like to do is to take 30 seconds and explain to you the semiconductor supply chain. And if you're someone like me, who, when you hear the word supply chain, has a tendency to fall asleep, I would say, hold on, give me 30 seconds, and I will tell you something that is not just important for the chip industry, but also important for understanding, I think, the geopolitical landscape today. If you want to make an advanced semiconductor, you need to do a couple of things. First, you need to design semiconductors using ultra specialized software. That's the EDA software that's used to make chips. There are three companies that produce the bulk of the world's EDA software. They're all located in the United States. And so this chart is going to show you market share in the supply chain step by country. So almost all the software to make chips is in the United States. Next, you need to harness intellectual property to bring different building blocks together to produce chips. That's almost all in the US or in the UK, in Europe. After that, you need materials like silicon wafers, the ultra purified silicon out of which most semiconductors are made. There's just a couple of companies, largely in Japan, that produce the highly purified and refined materials that are needed for chip making. Then you need to acquire the fabrication tools, the tools that actually make the chips, etching machines, deposition machines that can deposit thin films of material as thin as 4 atoms thick with basically perfect uniformity. And the lithography machines, remember that word, more on that in a minute. We're gonna have a quiz afterwards. Who can remember the word extreme ultraviolet photolithography? All of the world's advanced chip making equipment is produced by 5 companies in 3 countries: the Netherlands, Japan, and the United States. Then you actually need to design and fabricate the chips. The design largely happens in the United States. Companies like Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, Apple. But the fabrication mostly happens in East Asia, and especially when you're talking about the high-end chips that make AI possible, it's all in Asia. All in Taiwan for the processors, almost all in Korea for the memory chips. And the smallest player, the shockingly small player on this list is, of course, China, the manufacturing superpower which produces now over a third of the world's manufacturing output, is not a large producer of high-end chips. In fact, it can't produce the most high-end chips. It's half a decade behind the Taiwanese when it comes to advanced processors. China's the world's largest importer of semiconductors. And every year for the past decade, it's spent just as much money importing chips as it spent importing oil. We've heard a lot this week about China's reliance on oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz, but I would posit to you that in the long run, Chairman Xi is less worried about his imports of oil from the Middle East and more worried about his import of chips from Taiwan, because there's only one supplier, and it happens to be in a country that he considers a renegade province, but that the United States has pledged to defend by force. And so this series of choke points across the supply chain, the software tools being dominated by the United States, the chip manufacturing tools being controlled by just 3 countries, the Japanese, the Dutch, and the United States, the manufacturing all in Taiwan. This explains why today, despite a decade of trying, a decade of pouring tens of billions of dollars each year into its own chip industry, China still remains far behind when it comes to the most advanced semiconductors. It explains why when it comes to the training and deployment of AI systems, in China, it almost all happens on chips made in Taiwan. Whether it's Alibaba or DeepSeek, their AI systems are trained on Western designed and manufactured chips, even still, partly legally purchased, partly smuggled in. And you'd only build a AI ecosystem on smuggled chips if you had no other option. And that's the situation that China finds itself in today. And why not? Why can't China produce its own semiconductor supply chain? Not because they haven't tried, not because they haven't put probably $1 trillion in the effort over the past decade, because the machines that make chips and the production processes of the materials that are used in semiconductors, these are the most complicated systems that humans have ever devised. So this is the tool I mentioned earlier, the word I wanted you to remember, extreme ultraviolet photolithography. These are the advanced tools that are required to manufacture cutting-edge chips. They're produced by just a single company, ASML, the largest technology company in Europe. And these tools have taken 35 years to develop, largely out of technology that emerged out of the US national labs. They cost, in their most advanced iterations, $350 million a piece to purchase. And they have among the most sophisticated and precise components that themselves have ever been deployed, like the flattest mirrors humans have ever devised inside in their lenses, the most powerful laser ever deployed in a commercial device, and an explosion happening constantly as a tiny ball of tin drops through a vacuum, is pulverized twice by the laser, explodes into a plasma that measures 40 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The plasma emits light at just the right wavelength to bounce off a dozen of the flattest mirrors humans have ever made, land on your silicon, and interact almost perfectly at the atomic level to produce the circuitry that makes your smartphone work properly or makes ChatGPT possible. When you start digging into systems like these, you understand why it's not easy to catch up. You understand why there's only one company in the world that can do this type of machining. And this isn't just a single chip making machine. This is one of the many machines you need to make an advanced semiconductor. And none of the technology you take for granted would be possible without tools like this. And so in some ways, the fact that those tools are assembled in Europe using components from Europe and the United States, every one of those tools is partly manufactured in Connecticut as well as in California, gives the West an extraordinary amount of advantage. But when it comes to the actual manufacturing of chips, where most of those tools are actually deployed, they're deployed largely in Taiwan, which today runs the largest number of those machines of any country in the world, all owned by TSMC, the chip maker that is the sole supplier of advanced silicon to nearly all of America's largest chip companies. NVIDIA sources all of its key silicon from TSMC. So too does Apple. So too does Qualcomm. So too does AMD. If you look at the 10 largest companies in the United States by market capitalization, other than Berkshire Hathaway, they're all companies that couldn't exist without silicon from TSMC. NVIDIA, Broadcom, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, our entire tech ecosystem, our stock market, our whole economy depends fundamentally on silicon from Taiwan, which is good in the sense that the Taiwanese are extraordinarily capable at making advanced semiconductors. They've done it with steady advances and decreasing cost every single year since TSMC was founded in 1987. The only problem, of course, is that TSMC is not located in Texas, but in Taiwan, which puts not just the semiconductor industry or the technology sector, but really our entire modern civilization at risk if something were to disrupt that. And I worry not only about the seismic activity in Taiwan, I also worry about their neighbors across the straits. And that, I think, is a problem that we underestimate at our peril. Because AI, as many of you all know, is not something that is for the future, it's something that's already happening. And it's not just happening in chatbots, it's not just happening in Silicon Valley, it's happening in the more mundane segments of our economy that are already beginning to deploy semi-autonomous operation at scale. So here's an interesting chart, the auto industry, which has been around for 100 years. But unlike in the days of Henry Ford, today you can't make a car without semiconductors, and not just a couple, usually 1,000. A new car will often have 1,000 chips inside. And the most rapidly growing type of chip over the next 5 years is expected to be the chips that make semi-autonomous driving possible. In other words, the types of chips that we rely on the Taiwanese to produce. And cars aren't unique. They're part of a broader trend. Our industrial base is increasingly reliant on semi-autonomous action. Semi-autonomous action requires advanced silicon. Advanced silicon comes from Taiwan. My other favorite example is agricultural equipment. A new John Deere tractor will often have multiple GPUs installed on it, so it can undertake computer vision while it looks at different plants and figures out what's a crop and what's a weed. In other words, our agricultural base needs advanced silicon too. And the same is increasingly true for every segment of the industrial economy. And I think this is a trend that has a long way to run because the cost of deploying AI is falling rapidly. More rapidly, I think, and I'm open to anyone who disagrees or can find a counterexample, but I've been searching for one and haven't found one. I think the cost of AI over the past 3 years has fallen more rapidly than anything else in human history. We've seen a 100-fold decrease in the price of asking a question to an AI model since the release of ChatGPT. It's an extraordinary price decrease. And when prices fall, we use more of it. And that's exactly what we're seeing across the economy right now. Now, there are some challenges. One challenge is power. As you build more data centers full of more semiconductors, requiring more cooling equipment, you need more electricity. And although the chip industry delivers vastly more energy efficient chips every year, they're even better at producing more performant chips. And so the rate of improvement of energy efficiency is regularly outstripped by the rate of improvement of the chip industry's ability to give us more computing power. And so although energy efficiency per unit of computing is much, much better than it was 5 or 10 years ago, we're producing so much more computing power that we've seen an explosion over the past half decade in the amount of electricity required to build data centers, the data centers that all of this AI will rest on and be deployed inside of, which I think is a strategic challenge because you ask yourself, who's going to win the computing power race? It's going to be us. Us and the Taiwanese, we're going to produce vastly more capable semiconductors over the next 5 years than the Chinese. But if you ask who's going to win the electrical power race, well, it's going to be China by a wide margin. China's been dramatically growing electricity production every year for the past 4 decades. We've basically added no new power for the past 15 years. And so a key challenge for us is to convert our advantage in the digital sphere into an advantage in the real world, where we need to produce more electrons and deliver them to data centers in a way that is confronting the unfortunate reality of our permitting regimes and our grid access. But I think we should expect the tech sector in both the United States and in China to continue demanding bigger and better data centers, because every technology CEO that you listen to is making the same bet. If you want to deploy AI at scale, you need more and more computing power. And governments have registered this because the tech CEOs keep saying it. So listen to the CEO of DeepSeek. He's regularly said his #1 challenge is getting access to the advanced chips that his cutting-edge data centers require. And if he keeps saying this, you can bet that both Chinese and US leaders will believe that it's a critical national goal. And what's more, as we deploy AI in many different types of devices, we're going to become even more reliant on the semiconductors that make it possible, both the high-end semiconductors that are going to process the AI, but also a lot of the simpler semiconductors that will run the sensors and manage the data transfer between systems. If you ask yourself, why does a car require 1,000 semiconductors today? Partly it's because we've automated a lot of the windshield wiping features and the windows going up and down, things that you probably don't need, but you might like those features. But a lot of the new chips in a car are not just processing the autonomous driving features, they're handling the sensors too. The LiDAR, the optical sensors, the audio sensor that lets you say, call mom, and have your phone call your parents. All that is enabled by semiconductors too. And the same trend in cars or in tractors is happening everywhere in our economy. And that's where China has actually an interesting advantage. Because when it comes to the lower end semiconductors, the more mature technologies, China is investing far, far more rapidly than anyone else in the world. And what we're seeing in low end semiconductors is, I think, almost at a point of crisis for the Western chip industry, because China is trying to do in low-end semiconductors what it's already done in steel and solar and now automobiles. Pour money into mature technologies and dominate the manufacturing in a way that makes it impossible to invest in new manufacturing capacity outside of China. And so we've seen Japanese and Taiwanese and European and American firms say we can't invest in mature semiconductors because if we do, China will put us out of business. And so we risk, I think, if we're not careful, finding ourselves in a situation where we've got the high end, but we can't operate the high end with a lot of low-end semiconductors that we're increasingly sourcing from China, which matters both because it introduces supply chain risk and also because it introduces cybersecurity risk that we're just, I think, beginning to reckon with. This is one of my favorite stories of last year. I wouldn't have guessed that shipping cranes would have been at the center of US-China competition, but US intelligence believes that there were unexpected modems that were deployed on shipping cranes produced by Chinese companies. Now, there could be non-nefarious explanations for this. There are also nefarious explanations. I have no idea which one is right, but I would posit for all of you that as every part of our industrial base becomes more semi-autonomous in its action, we're going to face dilemmas like this in every part of the industrial base. And we're already seeing that playing out. It's now illegal to use many types of Chinese components in connected car features, the features of your car that let you connect to the network or utilize semi-autonomous driving features. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the same regulations in tractors too, because the same basic dilemma is at play. You want to be able to operate your industrial systems remotely, and you want them to work on their own. But you want to make sure no one else can access them remotely either. And the more you source from China in terms of hardware, the more that security risk becomes more and more difficult to manage, which is why we've seen political leaders over the past couple of years, not just this administration, but the prior administration as well, focus not only at the high end, the most advanced semiconductors, but also the entire electronic supply chain, down to the printed circuit boards and the displays and even the resistors and capacitors that make electronic systems work. We've seen Commerce Secretary Lutnick, for example, talk about flat panel displays, today almost entirely produced in Korea and increasingly in China, as a potential national security risk. And we've seen the president tweet in all caps just to make sure you didn't miss it. Not that you would ever miss one of his tweets. the entire electronic supply chain, he said, is a national security priority. And I would posit that although the last administration didn't tweet in all caps, they had essentially the same view, or they were moving in the same direction. That you actually had to think across the entire electronic supply chain, not only for the most advanced semiconductors, which is going to be a real challenge for the American technology industry, given that our strategy, our collective strategy over the past 4 decades has been to integrate our electronics industry more deeply with China than any other segment of our economy. And unwinding that is going to be complicated and long and expensive. And so as the US government thinks about tariffs and thinks about imposing tariffs at the component level, so not just on chips, for example, but on chips embedded in systems as they cross the US border, you begin to look at a single component of an electronic device and ask, how can you begin to unwind what's made in China, what's made in Taiwan, what's made anywhere else? It's a mind-bogglingly hard problem, particularly because all of our technology companies have deliberately embedded themselves so deeply in Asia-focused supply chains. And we've seen over the past couple of months just how costly that strategy can be when some of the key minerals that we're sourcing for electronic and mechanical systems alike are coming almost exclusively from a single country. But I'd like to suggest to you that although we've got increased urgency in our supply chain shifts, this is going to be a decades-long process, because building a single new chip-making facility takes 3 or 4 years, and a new cutting-edge facility costs twice as much as an aircraft carrier. And if aircraft carriers turn slowly, supply chains are even more slow in their rate of change, which means we have, I think, a generational long challenge of extricating our technology sector from China without doing so at such high cost. We set our entire economy back. This, it seems to me, is the cutting edge of the chip war, if you will. It's a challenge for US policymakers as they look at our trade relationships and look at the security implications of those relationships, and it's not going to be easy. But I think it's also something we can't ignore, because the implication of AI as we deploy more intelligence in more types of devices means we'll be even more reliant on the components and above all the semiconductors that make it all possible. And so understanding and being strategic in where we source those components from is, I think, going to be more important than ever. And we've got to get it right, because just like during the Cold War, how our national defense strategy then was predicated on deploying computing power at greater scale than our adversaries ever could, we're making this same bet today. We know we're not going to outproduce China when it comes to planes or ships or cars or tractors or anything else. China produces 3 times as much industrial output as the United States. Even in defense spheres, we're not going to win by quantity. The only thing we can produce more with our Taiwanese partners than China is transistors, the little switches that make ones and zeros possible. And we've still got a real advantage when it comes to our ability to produce computing power, which is why China is still focusing most of its efforts on smuggling in from Taiwan. That's the bet we're collectively making. It's not a bet just for this administration. It's a bet we've been making over the past 70 years. And ensuring we've got access to the chips that make that bet viable is, I think, the most fundamental national security challenge that we face. In other words, the chip war is really at the center of our effort to compete with China, just like it's at the center of our effort to deploy AI across our economy, which means that although many of you don't spend much time thinking about semiconductors today, I think you'll spend even more time thinking about them in the future, because AI can't work without them. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Please.
And if people have to go, I understand it's 10 o'clock. Chris, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm Jennifer. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Do I have to turn this on? Okay. All right. We're just going to have a few questions. But first, I want people to know how fantastic this book is. I've been reading it. I'm almost finished, but it is the history of the semiconductor industry. And it really starts, in my opinion, during World War II is when it starts. And it outlines all the cast of characters, that's how you describe them, all the pioneers who brought this industry to life. So it's not, this book isn't just about the industry and how it was shaped, but all the different innovators and entrepreneurs. And you do an excellent job of describing the dance, as you said, with the use of these, the chips for defense, but then these innovators wanting to create use cases and make this technology commercially available. This book is so fabulous. You'll learn that we learned so much from the uses of chips in World War II, and Vietnam was really a testing bed for their accuracy for our bombs and whatnot. I think you had in the book only 20% of what bombs that we dropped in Vietnam actually hit the targets. So it's really just an incredible book. So I just have a couple of questions for you. The first one is, we all know that Trump has imposed these tariffs on many products internationally. What impact do you think that might have on the semiconductor industry looking forward?
Yeah, no, I think it's a key question right now. The administration is still devising their tariff strategy on semiconductors. There's a special investigation that is semiconductor focused that is underway right now. And I think there's pretty active debate within the administration as to what their strategy should be. I think there's one school of thought that says if you want domestic production, what better way than to impose a tariff on foreign production? You'll have more people building chip factories here. And there's obvious logic to that. I think the challenge is that, as I showed, the chip industry is the most internationalized of really any we've got. And as a single chip isn't produced in a single country, it's produced across multiple different borders. And changing that structure is going to take a decade. And so there's another school of thought administration that says we've got to be pretty careful because imposing tariffs on chips is actually a tax on AI. It's a tax on US tech companies. And certainly we want more domestic production, but we also don't want to really harm our technology companies in the process. And so that debate is underway right now.
So right now it's all being kind of left alone.
I would say it's a live debate right now,
Okay.
and we should expect some conclusion of that debate over the next couple of months. But how exactly it plays out, I mean, ultimately, it's the president's decision.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the CHIPS Act. What do you see as like the most promising impacts of the CHIP Act? Is there some promising things that will come out of it?
So the Commerce Department has great data on investment in chip making facilities over the past several decades. And what you see is a line that goes like this, and then it falls in the 2000s and 2010s, and it shoots up like this. And the last 4 years have seen a roughly 10x increase in investment in chip-making facilities relative to the trend over the prior decade. So there's been a huge increase in investment driven by the CHIPS Act.
Okay.
There's no question that has been.
And those, where are we seeing that mostly? Texas, Arizona, any other areas of the country?
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of different locations. Texas and Arizona are probably the two largest, but in Oregon, in Idaho, in New York, a bunch of different states. I think the most important strategically are the investments that the Taiwanese company TSMC are making in Arizona.
Okay.
Where they are producing not their most advanced chips, but one generation behind the cutting edge. Today at small volumes, but over the next decade at increasingly large volumes. And so I think that as they keep building out that site, we're going to find ourselves in a much less risky position than we are today.
Okay.
Today we're sourcing everything from Taiwan. In a decade, we'll be able to source a substantial portion of what we need from TSMC in Arizona, so long as they keep investing. And I think that's going to be a big change.
You had said, did you say 90% of what we purchase, from a chip manufacturing perspective is coming out of Taiwan? Did I hear you say 90?
When it comes to advanced chips in general, 90%.
Okay.
When it comes to AI chips, it's 99%.
Oh gosh, okay.
And I think they actually rounded down. It's probably 100%, but they were afraid of that number.
So as TSMC continues to expand their capabilities in Arizona, will that drop?
Yes.
And significantly or just?
I think a reasonable estimate would be to say by the early 2030s,
Okay.
TSMC will have 20 to 35% of its production in Arizona, which still means the majority is in Taiwan. But the United States, we're 25% of global GDP. We consume maybe 30 or 35% of the world's advanced chips. So if we have ballpark a quarter of the world's advanced production in the US, that's not so far off from our total domestic demand, which gives us a lot more room for maneuver than if we had zero, which is
Gotcha.
what we have right now.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on how we can deal with China from an adversarial perspective and protecting Taiwan? Is this something that you lose sleep over at all? I do. I'm not going to lie, but like, just, what are your general thoughts on how we can continue to protect Taiwan?
I think there are two facets. One is obviously military deterrence. And the key challenge is that our ability to defeat China militarily has declined every year for the past 3 decades as Chinese military power has grown. And every year the Pentagon releases its China military power report, and every year the picture gets darker. So that's a real challenge. I think the second challenge is that our ability to impose economic costs in China has also fallen dramatically because China's gotten much more self-sufficient in its manufacturing base. So today, if you look at what does China import from the outside world, a lot of agricultural products, a fair amount of oil still.
Yes.
But the most important is actually semiconductors from Taiwan. And I worry that as China gets more self-sufficient in chip production, which is putting $50 billion a year into its self-sufficiency efforts, ballpark, it's going to rely less on importing semiconductors and therefore be even more insulated from the economic shock of a potential conflict.
So in your book, in I think it was the 2015 era-ish, Brian Krasanik, you explain, goes to Congress, I believe, and is saying, look, China's subsidizing, did I read that,
Yep.
like chip manufacturing in China, and that's making it difficult for us, the Intels of the world, possibly also the Microns of the world, I believe, and they have a plant in our backyard here, and they are present here today. Is that happening now? Is China's government subsidizing, this industry as well today?
Enormously.
Enormously. Okay.
So in 2014, Chairman Xi declared chips a core technology, in his words. And since then, it's hard to get exact figures because China spends at the national level, the provincial level, the local government level, private equity funds that are actually controlled by the party. But ballpark, China spent 1 CHIPS Act per year for the past decade.
Wow.
So 10x what we're spending would be my rough estimate.
Wow. Well, I know you have a full day ahead of you. I'm just going to end by a fun, random question. But I do want everyone to know if this book really goes through the history again of the semiconductor industry, all the major players from Morris Chang, Andrew Groves. I mean, I read his book, Swimming Across, years ago. His story of being a Hungarian immigrant, escaping World War II. His mom smuggled him out of Hungary. Just the serendipitous nature of how all these people played a role. And it explains why TSMC is in Taiwan because of Morris Chang, who came from Texas Instruments. This is excellent. It reminded me of when I read Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs. I couldn't put it down. And also because it's, basically an 80-year history, I think, if I'm doing my math right, I could connect to it from a generational perspective. But anyway, there's an interesting little story in there. It's about Micron. I don't know if people know this, but based out of Idaho. They produced DRAMs, dynamic RAMs, and one of their major investors was, and I can't remember his name, Simplot, yeah. He was actually was he a potato farmer?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. And so
America's largest potato farmer.
Right, so he supplied McDonald's 50% of their French fries.
Right.
He drove around in a car called his license plate, Mr. Spud.
That's right.
He invested $1 million into Micron. It's now, over $1 billion industry. And my question to you is, who out of all these cast of characters, was there one that really struck you as being? I mean, there's a lot in there, that came from Fairchild and whatnot. But was there one that just really resonated with you or motivated you, inspired you?
Well, he's certainly one of the most interesting by far. I think the other was Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC. We've had a lot of successful immigrants in the United States. Morris Chang is the most successful immigrant. He was born in China, moved to the US, spent his career mostly here in Texas. And then in one of the greatest errors of US business history, Texas Instruments passed him over for the CEO job. And so he left TI, and the Taiwanese government gave him a blank check to start a chip maker in Taiwan. And that's why, as I joke with him, TSMC stands not for the Texas Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, but for the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. He's an extraordinary entrepreneur, but also I think a warning sign for the United States, which is to say that unless we're attracting the world's smartest minds, we risk losing the world's best businesses. And I think especially at this moment, learning that lesson from his career is particularly important.
Yes, that's why H-1B visas are so important.
Yes, indeed.
So, well, thank you so much for coming here, Chris.
Thank you for having
me. And thank you, Millie, for bringing Chris to us. This was great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Do you mind if I get a couple pictures?
Oh, of course.
And then I would love for you to sign this.
Fine.
Okay. All right. And then here you go. This is our annual meeting.
This one didn't, but for good reason.
Yeah,
So thank
okay.
you so much for joining today. I'm sure we could stick around for another hour and talk about this.
Here, we'll take
Have a great summer.
we'll get
Take
Bruce
care.
up here. Bruce, let's get a photo. Yeah.